two students. Today it's Friday, March 13th. And as we discussed just a little while ago, most likely you are aware that we are currently in the pandemic of the COVID-19 viral infection, and everything's closing down. Toilet paper's gone. Everyone's buying all the water. Schools are closing. I apologize. My kids are downstairs playing video games, having the time of their life. And as I said, you'd be in good hands because I teach Bio 1 online, and I've been doing that for 19 years. And so I have a plan. And so this is my plan. We're going to try it out. I like being proactive and being a little bit ahead if I can. So you might remember back in lecture, and this was really an accident. I didn't obviously foresee things going down this way. But you might remember back when we were doing Unit 2, or Unit 1, sorry, Unit 1A. So this should be your Unit 1A here. And you might remember that I skipped over this section. I said, I talked about cladograms, but I said, the idea of how these split. So we talked about different taxa, and we know what a cladogram is now because we've talked about that. But why? How do you get that split? What causes that split? Or why did that happen? And I said the why and how is interesting, but it's really not relevant at this point. So the setup we're going to deliver as I continue for some of the semester, at least for the lecture part, is I'm going to take the same slides you have access to, and you'll notice in this particular one I put you can see my face down there, but it's really a green box. So in the lower left-hand corner of the screen is a green box because that's where, when I'm done, I'm going to move the video. So your PowerPoints that you would be following along with should look pretty much just like mine. Same stories. Everything is going to be the same. But the difference is I might have had to move things around a little bit. And so that's what you'll see in that box there. We already talked about this a little bit, about cladograms a little bit more, and monophyletic groups. Those are just groups that include all the ancestors and don't exclude anybody, and have the most common recent ancestor and things of that sort. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but another thing, or another kind of sort of cladogram, I'll mention it since we're here, the ultrametric trees. Normally, cladograms, they show you a branch, right? And I think we talked about this. That branch shows you that there's an evolutionary event that happened there, but you don't know how long ago that was. So is that 10 years or 40 million years or whatever? So in an ultrametric tree, you have the same thing. You have a cladogram with the branches, but then on top of that, they have sort of a sense of time. So this shows you the different eras and maybe when those events occurred. So just a little bit more information. We already talked about the 3 domains, so you already know about that. We've covered most of those already. If I were doing this class entirely online, maybe I would go over those a little bit more, but I'll assume that at this point, since we're kind of just started, I think we're okay. But this is where we kind of left off. I think most of you will find this information pretty easy, or have had it at some point, but this deals with how we get those branches. So there are many people that contributed to the understanding of how life might change over time, and we call that process evolution, the genetic change of a group of organisms over some period of time. It's one way to do it. And another definition of kind of that same thing is differential reproductive success, meaning that some organisms reproduce at a differential rate or are more successful than others. And over time, those traits, if they're genetic, tend to be passed on. And the most famous sort of person that most people know about when they talk about evolution is, of course, Charles Darwin, who published The Origin of Species in 1859. And if you know about Charles Darwin, what you probably know most is about Darwin's finches, and the idea that Darwin collected these finches on his journey and then identified them as new species, and that became sort of the theme that they maybe started at one place, and over time they blew out onto this island on the Galapagos Islands, and those species over time changed and ended up being new distinct species. And that's kind of what most people know about. But what people don't seem to remember, unless you read Charles Darwin's book, Origin of Species, one of the brilliant things about Charles Darwin is that he starts off the book with actually a lot about farming and how if you take certain animals and you breed this kind of pigeon with that kind of pigeon, you get this kind of pigeon. And so there's a great deal in the beginning of the book, not about finches or humans turning into or coming from monkeys, as I always hear people think that that's what they associate with the word with evolution. But he talks a lot about farming in the beginning and lays a pretty good case for it. But the idea that organisms can change over time is associated with evolution and Charles Darwin. But then we can look at evolution at different sort of rates, and we can look at evolution in the sense of it being large changes or small changes. So if there are small changes, we call that microevolution. And if there are large changes over a relatively long period of time, we call that macroevolution. And there are different ways we sort of study that. We use fossils and DNA and what we call homologous structures. That's where we compare things that are similar, like the bones in, say, a gorilla's arm and a chimpanzee. They're quite similar with the bones and the muscles and so forth. So we say those are homologous structures. If you look at a wing on a bat or the wing of a bird, they share some similarities. So you could say those are homologous to one another. And then there's the function sign, which we'll get to later on. But in this case, we're talking about the actual genetic relationship of them. Now, when things are related and when things change over time can occur sort of in a couple of different ways. So over a long period of time, one species, that's what they're showing here, this bird, this one bird, say, over a long period of time might change and become this bird. That's called anagenesis. That's where one species over a long period of time changes, becomes another. And the idea is this one no longer exists. Oh, whoa. Something happened there, an evolutionary event, which led to that one species over time now becoming two. That's called speciation. And in both cases, you're getting speciation in the sense that something changes over time. But to get a branch, we really want this kind of cladogenesis for our explanation, at least. And then the next thing is, can we go out there and can we find it? Well, that split, what makes things split from one group to two groups, is that usually over time they accumulate genetic differences and they become different and they become separate. But often those will keep mixing. If certain traits are favorable, they'll switch in the population. So the next thing is, how can you make a barrier? I did it once again. Apology. There we go. So what we're talking about here is the same change occurring. And does the change occur in one spot or in different spots? So in allopatric speciation, the idea is that you have a population of something. You have one species and maybe it looks like this. In this case, it's fish, probably African cichlid fish in Africa. And what happens is there's some kind of drought that dries up the ponds, and you end up with two ponds, and maybe you get a small pond, or maybe you get a deep pond, but you end up with that one thing now being separate into two very separate spots, and that over time genetic variation can occur, and that one thing can now become two things. And so when the water returns and maybe they're mixed again, the idea is that maybe you can have two species where before you had one. In sympatric speciation, the idea is that one species, for whatever reason, it could be, there's many reasons that are cited. It could be behavioral, or it could be a genetic mutation, or it could be something they eat. But some kind of thing leads that one group to split into two distinct groups, where over time, although they're all in the same area and have access to each other, there's two strategies or two differences, and that over time those become sort of reinforced and you end up with two species. A long time ago, back when I was originally taking general biology, the idea of evolution was taught, and if you watch these old videos, you'll still see this. The idea was taught that change occurred at, we called it gradualism. And gradualism sounds like it's gradual, which it is. And the idea of gradualism is that over a period of time, there's some nice, slow, consistent change and things evolve at some particular rate. However, I don't doubt that there's always some gradualism going on somewhere. There's always genetic change in a group of things over time. But the other thing that we notice when you look in the fossil record, it's not so smooth in the fossil record, which we'll talk about later on, where there's these very big jumps or very distinct rapid changes, that life sort of seems to not evolve necessarily gradual all the time, but there's these big jumps or changes, and we call that punctuated equilibrium. And the idea is that what happens is there is some kind of catastrophic event. So let's say there's a volcano that erupts, or you have a volcano. That's the volcano. This is my land, and let's say I have a big earthquake or that kind of thing. Or let's say you have some virus that happens to go through and it wipes out most of the species in the world, but not all of them. And you already probably know my skills at drawing aren't getting better online. Maybe I need more practice. So we've already accepted that. But anyway, the idea is that I forgot where I was going with this, which is also just like lecture. But anyway, there's the big events, maybe a volcano, maybe a earthquake, or maybe a virus goes through and it wipes out 90% of the different species. So there's these big, usually some kind of catastrophic event. And once all those species are gone, that competition is gone, and that sort of frees up the normal evolutionary changes that can occur in an organism. So it doesn't really cause them to evolve directly. So that comes from, say, the genetic changes that are naturally accruing in organisms. But suddenly the competition, because most of life, 20%, 50%, depending on the time period, gets sort of wiped out or disrupted in one way or another in one area or another, and that opens up the opportunity for rapid evolutionary change, and we call that punctuated equilibrium. Now, normally what happens is when we have a species that over time that species will change and split maybe into two groups, and then what happens is the problem is, I don't know if it's a problem, but the idea is that if that species, if those genes are beneficial to both groups, you'll have gene flow. So although that group separates, several things can happen, and we call those reinforcement. Oops, I did it again. We call those reinforcement. And reinforcement is the idea that as you have this change, the outcome will be that you keep reinforcing that hybrid zone, that whatever that difference is makes those two groups sort of distinct and keeps them going in that route and driving the uniqueness of those two things in that particular direction, let's say. Or you can get fusion. Let's say the idea of fusion is that the gene differences here really sort of benefit everything on both sides, and so you get rapid gene flow back, and that sort of gets rid of the hybrid zone. Or it could sort of stay where it is, meaning it doesn't fuse into one group, or it doesn't fuse into one group, and it doesn't go back into, it doesn't push away into two distinct groups, which would give you speciation, and it doesn't fold into one species, but instead you maintain sort of the hybrid. Now, that's sort of a long explanation for basically if you had, let's say rabbit A. So there's rabbit A, and here's rabbit B. Oh, that's not good. My office mate, Mark Cooper, says that this looks like a duck. But in this case, I'm trying to draw a rabbit. But let's say you have a rabbit, and the rabbits are different in one way or another. And although they're one species, they look a little different. Maybe one group of them tends to be darker, one tends to be lighter, or one has longer legs than others. Maybe they live in different regions, but they still reproduce with each other. And so you have this kind of gene flow that goes back and forth. That's a hybrid zone. And so we say that those two things maybe are like a subspecies. It depends on how you want to name it. The point is, we're talking about that branch again, and what we're looking at in the things we've seen so far, we're saying the branch has occurred, and that's why those two things are different. But the reality is, for a lot of species, there's some interaction between the two. So the way we study that is we look at things like fossils and molecular clocks, and we do lab experiments, and those are all used to figure out kind of where we're at in that. And that doesn't really terribly matter all that much to you in the sense that we end up naming this, mammals and birds or whatever it is, because at this point it's so long ago they're distinct. But the idea is that's how that branch takes place. Now, as we've already mentioned also, things like bacteria really changed the game greatly for us in our understanding of evolution, because we have what's called horizontal gene transfer, where in their own lifetime bacteria swap genes with one another. Some do it more than others, and so the idea of say a bacteria like Pseudomonas or E. coli being one species is kind of hard to really narrow that down like we would for almost every other species, where it's sort of genetically unique. Bacteria sort of break all the rules and do interesting things. And I had this in, it must have impressed me at one point. I saw the movie Annihilation. I guess they had mentioned horizontal gene transfer in there. I think they had some kind of plant that had human characteristics and various things. It had Natalie Portman in it. She was a biologist. It was a pretty good movie. Natalie Portman, I think she was a Harvard dropout. And that's not an insult. I'm just saying she went on to do awesome things. And, lots of people have dropped out of Harvard, it seems. And it's like they were on to bigger things, bigger than Harvard. I would have stayed maybe forever. I'd be a Harvard stay. But anyway, that